So I grew up in a little country church with very traditional gender roles, right? The women cooked and served, men built and repaired. In fact, in our case, the men of the church, mostly farmers, literally built the church we worshiped in. So boys helped the men fix things, and girls helped in the kitchen, which is why it was a little odd, as I've mentioned before, that I preferred to be in the kitchen washing and drying dishes. I don't like that anymore, but at the time. But I thought their conversations were much more interesting than fertilizer and crop rotation. So in our rural North Dakota setting, churches often had an annual dinner for the whole community, and the small town where I went to school had only two churches. One was Lutheran, and the other was Lutheran. One Lutheran church had an annual ham dinner, and the other Lutheran church always had a dinner of Swedish meatballs, which was odd because they were all Norwegians. But people drove from all over the place to eat those meatballs and boiled potatoes. But one year, one of the organizers had a hip replacement and couldn't be there to supervise the potatoes. And she worried that they would use boxed potatoes to avoid the pain of peeling them all. Well, the pastor went to visit Helen a few days before the event and assured her that there were women at the church that very morning peeling potatoes. And he said, "You sure must love cooking." And she replied, "Oh, heavens no, I don't like cooking at all. But I love Jesus, and this is what I can do for him." It's a great line. I love Jesus, and this is what I can do for him. And we all have our own ways. So speaking of those traditional gender roles, today's scripture makes me a little uncomfortable because it seems to affirm them, or at least not question them. But then, of course, it's the Bible, so what do I expect? But the men came home from the synagogue hungry and expected to be fed, but the one expected to feed them was in bed with a fever. And fevers were a big deal. You couldn't just take an Advil and feel better. But Jesus had other ideas. He went in, knelt down, took her hand, and raised her up. He restored her to health, and she jumped right up to serve them. But even so, don't you suppose Simon could have said, "Hey, Ma, take it easy for a little while. I'll make some sandwiches for the guys." But maybe because she loved Jesus, and this is what she could do for him. It still makes me uncomfortable. So I thought, well, let's dig a little deeper. Does Jesus intend to reinforce traditional gender roles? And so let's go back to the beginning of Mark. Mark, as you probably know, is always in a hurry. He doesn't have any stories about Jesus being born like Matthew and Luke, and he doesn't place Jesus in the context of the cosmic universe like the Gospel of John. Mark 1, verse 1 begins with how John the Baptist fulfills Isaiah's prophecy that a messenger would come to prepare the way for the Messiah, and then bam, verse 4, we're already baptizing people, calling them to change their hearts and lives. And just 5 short verses later, Jesus is baptized, and then immediately, which is one of Mark's favorite words, always in a hurry, Jesus was forced into the wilderness for 40 days and tempted by Satan. And Mark doesn't bother with any details beyond that, except to say he was among wild animals, and the angels took care of him. So now we're only 14 verses in, and John is arrested, and Jesus began preaching. "This is the time. Change your hearts and lives." And then he passed by some fishermen and called out to them, and suddenly he had his first 4 disciples. And they all went to the synagogue together, and Jesus started teaching, and the people were amazed. And why? Because he wasn't like the legal experts who simply read interpretations of the law. You know, imagine listening to somebody read the phone book to you. But there was nothing dull about Jesus. He stood there and said, "Now is the time. Change your hearts and lives." But in the midst of this, an evil spirit, someone with an evil spirit, yelled out to him. And Jesus told the demon to be silent and come out of the man. And the demon shook and screamed, and it did leave the man, leaving everyone who watched this happen feeling shaken. How can he do such a thing? And immediately, news about Jesus just spread all over the region. So that's when Jesus and his brand new 4 disciples left the synagogue and went to Simon's house to eat and rest. You know, it's probably their first day on the job, maybe their second. Can you imagine these new disciples wondering what they had gotten themselves into? But at least they knew it wouldn't be boring. And so they arrived at Simon's house and discovered his mother-in-law was in bed with fever. Jesus healed her, and so now news about her healing and news about the demon at the synagogue, and all of a sudden the entire town was outside the door begging to see Jesus. People brought loved ones and neighbors who were sick and demon-possessed to have Jesus heal them, and it went on all night. And in the morning, Jesus tried to find a deserted place for himself where he could pray alone. Imagine the exhaustion he would have felt of so many desperate people crying out in need, but they tracked him down. And so Jesus and the 4 disciples left town so they could spread the good news in other places. We're not even into chapter 2 yet, but Mark's in a hurry to share this good news. You too can change your hearts and lives. So back to Simon's unnamed mother-in-law. And, you know, I think she deserves a name. Maybe like Blanche or Henrietta, you know, something traditional. Well, she's notable in part because she's the first woman who appears in the gospel. But why must she be defined by her traditional gender role? And yet with Jesus, there's often more to what's on the surface. So let's dig a little deeper. So with her, the word that gets stuck in my craw is serve. And so on its own, it's a great word. But in the context of there's hungry men, so go fix them some dinner, well, that's a different thing. That's another thing. But it turns out that Mark chose a word that does indeed have a deeper meaning. In fact, it's the same word used just a few verses before when, remember, Jesus was out in the wilderness and the angels served him. Well, another way to translate that Greek word is to say the angels ministered to him. And the same word then applied to her. Simon's mother-in-law ministered to Jesus. And with that, one commentator said, she's the first deacon in the church. And another said, she's the disciple, one of the first to quietly demonstrate a way to follow Jesus. But is there a difference, or what's the difference is to serve someone versus to minister to someone? Does that ring any bells that might be slightly different? But to me it is. It's more, some synonyms for ministered to include tended to and nursed and comforted. And that's definitely more than fixed him some dinner. Though, maybe she did do that because that's what he needed. To minister to someone is to listen to what they need, even if all they need is someone to listen. And to minister to a community is to do what a community needs that you have the gift to fulfill. This church is full of ministers, and I'm not talking about those who are ordained, though we have our fair share, but folks like you who see a need and do it. Often never noticed or thanked. So, to be clear, to serve is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm not saying gender roles are necessarily a bad thing, But there is more to Simon's mother-in-law than jumping up to fix dinner. And it's a lesson that James and John, two of the new 4 guys who were there that day, watched this happen. They didn't get it. They saw this whole thing happen, but they still, some days later, had the nerve to ask Jesus, "We want you to do whatever we ask of you." Okay, what is that? "We want to sit next to you in glory, one at your right hand and one at your left." Imagine Jesus holding back the desire to curse them out, but actually that's more like my desire for Jesus to curse them out. But he simply said, "You know what? Whoever wishes to be great must be your servant." And then he added, "Even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister." And so yes, Jesus said about himself the same thing, used the same word as Simon's mother-in-law. She is an extraordinary example of a disciple. In fact, there's one more extraordinary thing about her. So remember, she was laying in bed with a fever, and Jesus came, took her hand, and raised her up. Well, the only other time Mark uses that specific word, raised, is about Jesus himself. At the very end of Mark, the second to the last verse, the women who came to prepare the body of Jesus for burial were told he was not there because he had been raised up, just as Jesus had raised her up. Simon's mother-in-law is definitely not a gender stereotype. And this passage is not confirmation that a woman's place is in the kitchen, as, if you can believe it, but of course you can, some male commentators have said this passage proves. So again, to minister to someone is to listen to what they need, even if all they need is someone to listen. And to minister to a community is to do what the community needs that you have the gift to fulfill. And as I said, this church is full of ministers, folks like you, who see a need. Some out front, others in ways that no one knows. And Jerry McInerney highlighted this in her moderators column a month ago. All the somebodies that nobody knows about. People who want no recognition, so of course we started recognizing them in our weekly Mission Minute. Like Alyssa James, who ministers to the community by counting the offering every week. And sings in the choir and has a toddler who brings us joy. And like Pam Adler, who ministers to the community by helping us learn each other's names. I mean, who gets those name tags ordered? Who puts them away and you leave them wherever it is around the church that you've left them? Or it's like Kim McDaniel, who ministers to us by preparing communion every month. All we know is that there's always bread on the communion table on the first Sunday. Did you know how or who did that? And Marjorie Walston, who comes into the office every week to go through those black pads to record visitors and send them a note of welcome. It is so important that somebody does that. So I could keep going around the room doing this very same thing. Dangerous to name anyone, fearing leave someone out. But these just are 4 examples of extraordinary people like Simon's mother-in-law who do what they can to minister to our community. So for them and every one of you who do only perhaps what you and Jesus know inside the church and out in the community, we say thank you, and we see you.